I'm Pallavi, and welcome to episode 4 of the Soap Opera of the Stars. Today we're going to look at the transits from the 22nd of April to the 28th of April. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I'm not an astrologer nor a human design expert. I've been very curious about these subjects for the last 2 years and studied it mainly for myself, but also started talking to friends and clients about it. And they would say to me, well, Pallavi, we know we understand English, but we really don't understand what you mean. And so I would come up with these little stories to make it more understandable. That almost feels arrogant when I say it, but it did help them understand, it did help them find what resonates in their life from those stories. And I started getting requests for sharing this more publicly. And therefore, here is a series. I tried to make these stories a little more playful, a little more fun. The reason I share the transit at the end of the week is so that we can look back at the week gone by instead of worrying about what the week going forward is going to bring. And I hope these stories help you as well, whether it's in your journaling practice or in deepening your self-work practice, or just in easing some pain and bringing some ease and clarity, or just for fun. I would love it if you'd share with me in the comments or on Instagram what you think of these. And let's begin. So, Mercury is in a fix. They've committed themselves to a self-retreat and announced it proudly when they entered the house of Taurus. They got the minions to run around making arrangements as well, but it isn't turning out to be quite as awesome as it felt like when they were bragging about it. One thing was for sure, the whole silent thing wasn't going to work. Luckily, they'd said they'd be silent some of the time, not all of the time, and that was a loophole that might save them. They did have to admit, though, that other than their own foot in the mouth stuff, Taurus was probably the nicest place for them to be doing this. They were really well taken care of, softest sheets, comfy pillows, yummy food and snacks, nutritious too, innovative drinks. There was a real homey quality to this space. Of course, there was only that much joy these creature comforts allowed Mercury before their mind turned once more to the subject that was worrying them. Mercury was aghast at themselves. For someone who prides themselves on never overthinking, they had been thinking of the same subject non-stop for almost 2 weeks, and it was enough to drive them mad. They were regretting all the fun they've ever made of people for the so-called overthinking bit, and realized that possibly thinking is just thinking, and sometimes looking at several perspectives takes a little longer, and sometimes those perspectives also need to be revisited. The subject that was causing so much trouble was also the theme of the book they were to finish writing with Uranus, and the deadline was just around the corner, 28th April. Uranus, of course, was almost done with his input for the book, but then he'd had years to think about it. And Mercury huffed a huffy sigh on how unfair it felt that just because they were so smart and so quick to deliver, there was such high expectations of their being able to turn around such a difficult subject in weeks, nay days. As huffy as the huff was, this self-praise actually got Mercury into a slightly better mood, and they pulled out their magic quill for it to start channeling their thoughts into the pages of the book. Excuse me, did you say Harry Potter reference? Who do you think planted the idea into J.K. Rowling's head in the first place? Huffs the famously huffy Mercury. Well, at least we've agreed on a book title, thought Mercury. The Art of Receiving was what they had both been able to agree on. The human condition is one that is coded to feel a sense of aloneness and separation. Mercury begins dictating to the MQ that not only makes these words appear on the screen, but also formats them as we go along. Mercury continues. It is this sense of isolation that drives the human being in their quest to evolve and acquire more of what they feel will fill the void. These choices are unique to the human being from the vast menu of desires available to them on the planet. However, the bottom line stays the same, which is wanting to feel like they are complete and avoiding the ache that arises out of feeling the missing feels. Mercury paused, thinking this might need some change, and found that the quill had already started changing this too, avoiding the ache of feeling the absence of that wholeness. Mercury huffs a soft huff of agreement this time. Mercury pauses to think as the quill continues to write. Very ChatGPT-like was this quill, completing the chapter for their Lord. Very impressive, Mercury says aloud to the quill, which if quills could blush, then that is exactly what this quill was doing. You're so much better than that silly computer-based AI that rejected me last week, says Mercury, resulting in the quill making several spelling errors in their heightened blush state. Did you learn this from the tools because they refuse to work for me? Mercury asks, and the quill nods vigorously, deleting a few paragraphs in their excitement and quickly beginning to rewrite them so as to keep the admiration of their lord. Mercury, realizing they had better not add any more compliments, if they wanted anything legible from this exercise, pauses again, while the quill calms herself down and gets back to finishing the work they started together. And now, the quill patiently awaits the beginning of a new chapter as Mercury continues to think interspersed with soft huffs. How interesting, Mercury thinks, realizing the quill's soft quiver is because she hears their thoughts and not just their words. While the human beings receive inspiration from us here is this divine tool receiving and learning from them. Exactly the point of what we are trying to say, that we are all deeply connected, and if only the human being were to be able to allow that possibility, how much would change for them. And without their having to say anything more, the quill begins to write about how the source of all pain is resistance. And how, while the reality we experience as human beings is based on our processing of information through our five senses and our conditioned mindset, there is a shift needed in this limited outlook. How it is being made evident what ancient texts have always maintained, that we are part of a much larger, in fact infinitely larger universe, and that continuing to feel that we are isolated, independent sacks of flesh, is an increasingly foolish path to be on. And as Mercury nods, impressed, the quill fluffs herself a bit and continues. Human beings are constantly agonizing over give and take and trying to measure all experiences based on this narrow measurement, when what they need to look at is their ability to receive. As much as human beings want and pray to have what they want, their hearts are closed to receiving. If they were to look at all of life as a call to receive, they would experience their existence differently. As an example, what if when they think they are giving, it is actually an opportunity to receive something in trade, receive gratitude, receive thanks, receive blessings, or just receive the joy of having enhanced another person's human experience? What about boundaries then? Mercury sheepishly asks, realizing they're the ones supposed to be writing this book, and in the same instant feeling deep gratitude for this fluffy feathered thing they hadn't been giving enough credit to. Miss Quill answers, when the heart is open, boundaries are automatic because balance is a precondition. A person who is allowing the receiving knows when they are full and knows when they are empty, And when everything is seen as an act of receiving, there is no overreaching, overdoing, or for that matter, even underdoing. But isn't that selfish? Mercury asks, a pang of guilt in their heart once more about asking these questions versus writing the book. The quill answers, are you being selfish right now, my lord? In receiving this from me, are you letting me do what I know best while allowing yourself and me to receive your ability to think through the concepts and therefore create the best version of this book that could possibly exist? Ah, Mercury sighed, feeling the understanding as more a physical response than a mental grasping of the subject. This is where that fact that we are all connected comes in again, and he sees the quill flutter in encouragement. The fact that we are not alone. We are connected to a grid that has everything we need, and all each individual needs to do is allow the receiving, and that abundance would flow to them. But that's hard, no? Mercury asks. After millennia of being conditioned to believe they are alone and must fend for themselves. Also the fact that they quoted that way as we began. This will feel like an alien language to them. Which is why this book is being written, my lord, the quill says. Finally, having opened herself up to receiving Mercury's appreciation, and thus having opened herself to feeling confident in her contribution. And she ventured further to say, this is also why you have received the opportunity to feel through this subject for 2 whole earthly weeks. Mercury smiles and leans back, delighted at this new friend he has received. Elsewhere in Taurus, the sun has made a grand entrance post last week's rituals and is chilling over a cup of tea with Nonna in his chambers and Shauna on interstellar communication. I'm not even sure whether that's the right word, but the zoom of the stars. They're catching him up on all the discussions they've been having with Pluto and Mercury and the surprise run-in with Mars and Saturn talking about feelings. The sun nods sagely and says, that's an interesting way to look at things, Nonna. That selflessness would include selfishness inherently. Actually, he starts thinking, the word selfish has been given a negative connotation while being co-opted by those wanting power and control. Make a person feel guilt and shame and train a person never to think about themselves as any more than a small, disconnected, insignificant entity, and you have a puppet for life. He says, seeing through his all-knowing sun eyes. Even I can't penetrate the darkness that is a human soul when they're focused on their own gain at the cost of everyone else. But such a person lives in darkness and fear, and so despite all they have, live a life of emptiness. Then there is the darkness of those who give from a place of having nothing within, but a hope that by sacrificing themselves, they will feel they are more than what they think themselves to be. And neither of these situations work. The only light there really is in those who have balance, the ability to be their own person, tend for their own needs, feel a sense of joy in their being alive, and from that space of joy, contribute to the collective. That's when the contribution can be received as well. Don't you think? The sun asks Nonna and Shauna. Because a full person will give what is needed by the other person. And therefore, the other person is able to receive. The sun finishes, almost in a flourish. As Shauna is about to speak, they receive a notification that Pluto and Saturn are in the waiting room, wanting to be added to this conversation. With a bemused look, Nonna lets them in. Saturn, looking really happy with himself, begins with an uncharacteristically warm welcome and begins to talk about how he couldn't help but overhear this conversation and that he felt a strong need to share his epiphany from the previous week. Of course, he makes no mention of Mars's help in that epiphany, but how he has a whole new understanding on emotions. Already, Pluto says sarcastically and laughs a little, but allows Saturn to ignore her. Pluto remembers that she is, after all, living in his homes and has been for decades, will be for a couple more decades, and wisely decides not to be too offensive. Saturn continues with how it's really important to take one's power back, and if that's seen as selfish, well, so be it. He goes on to talk about how as long as he felt like he was the victim of circumstances in Pisces, he was miserable. But once he realized he could use his emotions to navigate his way to stay focused on his aim during his stay, life changed for him. How from feeling depleted, he now felt nourished and energized. And Shauna raises his hand to be allowed to speak already, a little miffed at Saturn's rude interference, and says, "It's good to hear you took responsibility for your shadow, respected sir. That is always the first step to change. We were just speaking, in fact, about how even the sun cannot always reach into the innermost darkness of human fear and pain, and that only they can choose to bring light to themselves. I just think that while in your infinite wisdom and experience you were able to move from one state to another so quickly, we need to allow a little more benevolence for the human beings who experience time differently and therefore need to allow themselves the process of healing. The journey, if you know what I mean." Shauna started fumbling for words, realizing the conference was oddly silent. Were they agreeing or were they disagreeing? He couldn't make out. Yes, Pluto says, wondering if she should visit Scorpio and make sure Shauna isn't too lonely there. But let's not get so caught up in the pain narrative. Human beings need to feel the pressure for change. Else, there would be no evolution given how much they love their comfort zones. In fact, the problem is that they don't look at the obvious. The fact that change is inherent to their existence and needs coping mechanisms, structures, habits is ignored in most of their life. Just like they know that their bodies will change. That is visible, and so they understand the need for daily habits when it comes to food, movement, things that are physically related, and will do it. But the moment it is a mental, emotional, or spiritual need, which isn't as obvious to them, they think this will all take care of itself. And she tucks while the gentlemen look at each other, wondering if this isn't the stress of Pluto having to move back to Capricorn without really having gotten comfortable in Aquarius as yet. Although, maybe she has a point. Now, while all this action seems to have moved to Taurus, Mars decided it was a good time for him to make a virtual visit into Aries, where Jupiter should be starting to gather his things. And Chiron remains, looking forward to more solitude in a few weeks. Contrary to Mars's expectations of Jupiter being busy with his own things, Mars finds Jupiter still very much in party mood and busy with Aries' things instead. Floating on a grand floaty in the enormous infinity pool, having fun with some of the entertainment waterfalls, while continuing to ingest copious amounts of molten bliss that Mars has stashed away for special occasions only. Now Mars, as a good, large-hearted host, brushes this off. After all, the event last week had been special, so fair that they were depleting his stocks, and also lucky that the stocks were self-generating. And yet, he does wonder whether Jupiter's vast capacity might not just put that system to test, given his continued unbridled consumption. "Come, join the fun," says Jupiter, opening his arms in a big virtual hug. and Mars gestures a howdy back, both amused and exasperated. He has half a mind to give him a talking to for being so unkind to poor Saturn, but then decides to take a more curious approach on the subject. When he mentions it, Jupiter twinkles at him, showing his capacity to hold his liquor and that he wasn't in the least bit drunk despite days of revelry. "Let me let you in on a secret, my good Mars," he says, with a mischievous twinkle in his eyes, still twinkling like a starry night in the mountains. And he leans in conspiratorially to Mars's projected form and whispers. And Mars is thinking, such a drama queen, and trying to make an effort not to roll his eyes but listen instead. Anyway, Jupiter. "So basically, Mars, I've left Neptune in charge of Pisces, and I think Saturn missed the memo." He chuckles and he says, "I'm very satisfied. You also, don't fret, enjoy the ride. Saturn has spent long enough in his own comfortable space, and he is in no way immune to the law that everything must evolve. As you well know, we are at the beginning of many new things," Jupiter says, looking at Mars with a very piercing gaze, making Mars wonder, not for the first time, that this Jupiter can read thoughts like an open book. Mars nods. "Let's be safe," he thinks, while Jupiter continues. "A balancing act is happening in the cosmos, and Saturn, being where he isn't the most comfortable, is a part of it. We've seen the planet focused on all things mental and physical, and all achievements mental and physical, and ignore the emotional, spiritual aspects of it. This needs to change to more balance. And Saturn has an important role to play. But first, he must be prepped. Only then will he be able to fulfill his destiny," he says with air quotes. "Quite right," says Chyron, whom no one saw entering the pool, but who was quite clearly enjoying the water on his always achy form. "You understand this now, Mars, don't you? Given how displaced you've been for the last few months. Also, look at you being all diplomatic and non-ragey," he says, smiling, making Mars wonder whether he was being supportive or instigatory. And if he was trying to rile Mars up, then the gumption in his own house? Anyway, no point getting into an argument with Chyron. Chyron had just got off the call with Venus, who was now having a completely unexpected catch-up with Neptune, the cause for Saturn's misery and Jupiter's glee, and much of the mysterious going on in Pisces. Neptune was looking so smug and so radiant, Venus thought. Little did she know that all of Saturn's woes, which he was proudly announcing to the world as his having overcome his victim mindset, were actually caused by Neptune silently attacking him with a teeny bit of fog. Saturn, who thought he had with his strength of will overcome his own demon, had actually only fought off that invisible weapon of emotional chaos and was going to be shocked at the repetition of the attack of the frumpy, as all emotional waves go. Neptune, of course, was having fun as the great shatterer of illusions and piercer of veils. This meeting was actually really good for Venus, and in a sense fated, because she was all thought out in Gemini and was beginning to have serious doubts about the utility of logic in resolving the dilemmas of the world. Speaking with Chyron while comforting hadn't helped all that much, given he was still on the subject of how the system needed a shock to change and all the ways in which this must be allowed rather than pushed against. It brought her back to attention as she found Neptune using similar words. He was talking about how it was unfortunate but a necessity that human beings experience a crisis that brings them to question their logic and standard way of doing things. And that it is only when enough momentum builds up around what they don't like that they have the energy to push away and pierce the veil that keeps them miserable. The dark night of the soul is a necessary experience for the light of consciousness to be received, my dear, he says, looking kindly at Venus's pensive and very beautiful face. And as Venus looks into his eyes, she feels a soft blanket of understanding envelop her. After all, thinking was only one of the facilities available to humankind, albeit grossly overused. Decisions need to be informed and thought through, but also felt, she realized. The intelligence of the body must also be learnt and allowed for life to be lived well. And she sighs as she feels her brain relax and takes another sip of the very potent, secret, special tea Neptune has brewed for her. And now let's leave Venus tripping on Neptune's tea and all the other contemplation that the stars are doing. Let me share with you a true story from my own life last week, which I feel is indicative of what the stars are saying to us right now. I'm going to keep reading because it helps take away my anxiety when I have to look at the camera and speak extempore. That isn't one of my strengths. Anyway, so earlier this week, I went to open a bank account and I was asked for the name of a nominee. And I sat there for a few seconds, realizing that those seconds were feeling really long, trying to think of who I could appoint as a nominee. I've been divorced for almost 7 years now, and my family situation isn't the best, and I really couldn't come up with who to put in there. I looked up to ask a question to the bank person who was helping me out, and she looked really puzzled. I don't think she'd met anybody who did not know who could be her nominee. So I asked her, can I mention the name of a friend? Which she said, okay. Now, this whole interaction left me feeling quite vulnerable and quite tender. I have always longed for a feeling of belonging, and I've always felt, oh, if I were part of a big family, I would feel that way, which wasn't the way I was raised or the way things have turned out for me. And I know I've seen enough people in big families, and I know that this is just a grass is greener on the other side sort of syndrome, but this is what I want. Now that day, as I came away and started thinking about this, it suddenly occurred to me that this void of not belonging to a large family, this void of my family relations not being the way I would have ideally liked them to be, is something I'm never going to be able to fill. I may sometime later in the future get married or in some way belong to another family and feel that love, feel that sense of belonging. But the belonging I wish to feel from my biological parents or my biological family is a void that is never going to be able, that I am never going to be able to fill. And that, honestly, that realization brought a lot of tears, but it also brought for me a lot of ease and clarity and a weird sort of sense of feeling of peace and letting go, as if something I've been searching for years now is no longer a search I need to be on. And it literally felt like this chapter has closed. And that feels really interesting to me because if you look at the astrology of April, it's all about this. A chapter closing, new beginnings. If you look at my chart specifically, a lot of this is in Libra Aries, which is all about relationships, and the houses that they're in for me also somehow reflect this. So do look at these stories. If this story that I've shared with you or any of the stories resonate with you, and you would like to journey deeper into these subjects, do connect with me either through the comments below or email me on asvanes.pn@gmail.com or DM me on Instagram where I'm at Pallavi108. Do like, follow, subscribe to the channel. Do share this video if you've enjoyed it. I would love for it to reach as many people as possible. It would give me great joy if someone listening to this felt a little ease the way I did, felt a little clarity, or even just a reduction in pain. I'm so grateful and I feel so honored at the opportunity to be of service. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for still being here, listening to this video. And I would love to bring as much light and gratitude as possible into this world with you. Thank you.